Demetra and I are going to tag team in interpreting the chart of astrologer and publishing powerhouse Elsbeth Ebertin, who has been a longstanding ancestor in our community who I love. And so I'm going to minimize the biographical. I'll show you some photos. This is her depiction of her own chart and a photo of her as a child. This is some of the many things that she published. She was the mother of Reinhold Ebertin, who you might have heard of, and they went to conferences together in 1930s. And then she passed away in 1944. So, Demetra, let's dive in.
Okay. So I did not know hardly anything about Elsbeth. And then I became aware at some point that Jenn, you had written a book, a biography about her life. And when we realized that this was going to be the chart we were looking at, I glanced at the article you wrote in the Mountain Astrologer in order to get a sense of who she was. And I was absolutely stunned by the, not only by the volume of the work that she produced over the course of her life, but her strong stance as a dedicated astrologer and as for women's emancipation, which wasn't only words that she lived out in her life. And I had this like, I don't know, the feeling in your thumos where there's something in your chest that you become overwhelmed with the greatness of a person who, until Jenn's work, had been relatively lost to our knowledge, especially in America, because I think maybe only one of her books was ever translated into English. Yeah. So it's awesome to have one of our greats being represented, and just so many thanks to Jenn for facilitating that process. So so Kenneth, I don't know how we want to do this. If you're going
to, I'll tell you how I would like to do it, but you're not obligated.
Talk or do how is this happening?
Yeah. So the way I'd like to do it is Elsbeth comes into you for a consultation. I'm curious for both of you how long you would have prepared, if any. I know some astrologers, it's just that it comes out of the printer, they look at it and they dive in. Do you typically do a little preparation before seeing clients? And then what would you say? I'm very interested, and I'm hoping the audience is how all of us as professional astrologers, how do we actually tackle the interpreting of a chart when we're going to be talking to someone, when we're going to be actually doing a consultation? So that's the angle I'd like to approach this material with, but you're free to do what you need to do.
Okay. So if this were in fact a client, now, but by the end of my career, I would have not put in very much time preparing, but that my mode of doing a reading was not so much making pronouncements, but of asking the right questions and letting the client inform me how their life unfolded within the structure I'd created. But since that isn't the case in this kind of situation, that isn't exactly the process that can happen. So as a teaching device, if I were explaining to an astrologer how I would begin to approach the chart from a traditional point of view, and again, even all the years I was doing traditional astrology, I had the outer planets and I had the major asteroids, and I had 30 or 40 other minor asteroids that I'd put in. And so I'd layer the Hellenistic as the foundation for then filling in details with the other material. But here we're going to try and simplify it. And the first thing I do is to scan around the charts and see if there are any particular strong planets or weak planets in terms of both their zodiacal signs as well as their house locations. And this chart is outstanding in that Venus and the moon are both in the signs of their domicile. And even with the other dignities, they're very powerful. Whereas Mars and Saturn, that are both the malefics, are in the signs of their fall. And so immediately we have a situation, is there going to be some really powerful pieces of her life where she has the resources to manifest her potential and does so in a good and positive and fortunate way, and other parts of her life that are going to be very challenging and difficult. So that gives us like the first range impression. And then we might want to see, are the planets that are strong zodiacally, do they belong to the sect of the chart, or do they belong to the contrary sect? And because this is a day chart, the moon and Venus, which are her best planets, belong to the other sect, which means that they aren't always in the position to be most effective. And an analogy that I would use with my students is that there may be one political party that is in power, and that party, they have the authority to try to bring forth their agenda. They may or may not be able to, but they have the authority. Whereas the planets of the opposite sect, contrary sect, are the members of the party not in favor. And even though they have great ideas and they're terrific character, they may not be positioned to be able to do their best for the life of the native as a whole. So we have that dichotomy that there are things she's really, really good at, but the society or the culture or the larger environment in which she lives may not fully allow her to express the totality of the good that she could. Okay, so I'll pause here, and then when I come back, I want to focus on the lot of spirit, which is a career-oriented point, because her career was so amazing. Okay.
And for those that don't know, because we got a question, sect is simply whether the chart is a day birth or a night birth. Is the sun above the horizon line, which is the line between the ascendant and the descendant? If it's above that, it's a day birth, the day sect. And if it's below that, it's a night birth or night sect. And there's more to the doctrine, but that's for another seminar.
So when I would prepare this for someone, assuming she would come to me for a consult, in addition to the foundational techniques that Demetra has laid out, I would also add a medieval technique that does have roots in Hellenistic practice, but was really pushed heavily by Bonatti, called the triplicity rulers of the houses, which would give me an understanding of which planets are directly responsible for which specific topics. And each house has 3 different triplicity rulers that allow us to hone in on which planet describes, for example, the father, the mother, any potential pets, and also someone's leadership ability, the stability of their position. And I would glance through just to kind of see, in addition to the 2 malefics being in fall, I would want to see what those topics were actually specifically according to triplicity rulers, to get a sense of, a more, I guess, a clearer picture of what's hard. And also in turn, with the Venus and the moon, clearer picture of what might become more easily to her. So,
right, and that's a core piece of traditional astrology, is what does the planet rule, not only in and of itself, but what house topics of life is it in charge with? And so when you look at it, there's a focus, not in terms of everything means everything in every part of your life, right, but certain things have relevance in limited specific parts of your life, which right. is what you say someone, how's your life? How are you doing? Oh, I have a really great job, but I'm having problems with my relationship. So there's always a mix of good and bad. And it's useful to know which planets identify these different areas.
Right. And then as you time the chart, assuming she wants to know what's going to happen this year, then we start working with Time Lords.
Right.
And then that Time Lord being activated allows those topics to come to the surface, which
right.
Sometimes
like what happened with me, I'm preparing a whole Time Lords retreat now. And so my mind has been like steeped in Time Lords for the last 2 months. So I couldn't help but start doing some of that with this chart when I finally sat down with it yesterday. And one of the surprising things is you may think that a planet means something, but when you see what actually happens when it's activated by timing, you realize, oh, it didn't mean that, it meant something else. And so that becomes very instructive for the astrologer.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I did use zodiacal releasing on Elsbeth's chart when I published the article in TMA.
Okay.
I angled that towards a peak period on all 4 levels of her posthumous chart.
Okay. And I've actually am working with it in an ever so slightly different manner.
Okay, how is it?
Because I've like actually been sitting with chapters 1 to 10 of Valens, and it was like, I have to read this text until I can say that I understand 90% of the sentences. That might take you years to get to that.
Was that book 4?
Yeah, book 4.
Book 4, okay.
Yeah. And so they say that the lot of spirit, which is connected to the lot of fortune, as being the specific places in the chart where the powers of the sun and moon flow toward. And that the spirit, and here it is at 11 Virgo in the 11th house, has to do with one's profession or one's actions, what one does, a kind of intentionality, as contrasted with fortune, which is more bodily health and material comfort and well-being. So if we want to talk about a profession, then we start with a lot of spirit. And it is placed in the 11th house, which is a good house, the 3rd best house Hellenistically. It's rising toward the midheaven. So it has the potency of that. And that it also is not adversely witnessed by either Mars or Saturn in terms of squares or opposition. So it's in good stead. And then its ruler, which is Mercury, and you always want to look at the Lord of the lot, is in the 7th house in an angular house, which again gives it that strong dynamic potency. And while Mercury in Taurus is not in any of its own, I guess dignities is the medieval word, or rulerships, its Lord is Venus, who is like over the top in how potent she is in the chart. So one could say just from that, the profession will be strong, active. And I'm trying to think what B was, and that's quickly just slipped out of my mind, but it'll come back. And in general, it'll be, the outcome will be beneficial. Because Mercury is connected with Venus, one of the benefics, and it also is not squared or opposed by either malefic. So there's a positivity to the career. Now, in the timing system of zodiacal releasing, that many people, I look online, I see tons of articles about releasing. It's the first 20 years of her life, which is the minor period of Mercury, the ruler of Virgo, that sets the first stage for her career. And when she was 17, she had a loosing of the bond, which is this dramatic or sudden like shift or turning point or critical period. And that was connected with both her first publication and meeting her future husband. So those two ideas were linked. And then after 20 years, Virgo gave over to Libra, which ruled for the next 8 years, the minor years of Venus. And because Venus is the ruler of Virgo, that brings Venusian-like themes activated into the life. And it was right at the beginning of that period that she became married. I couldn't figure out the date, but it seemed to me it was like right around 1900, 1899, 1900. It must have been from what I pieced together. And I read a different TMA article, which you weren't doing releasing. So I was just pulling the biography. And then midway through that period, when the level 2 releasing came all the way down to Aquarius, which is ruled by Saturn, like a planet that has problems, that timed her divorce. So, and the reason she got divorced, according to what I read, is that her husband disapproved of her career in astrology.
Both her husband and her mother were actively, yes,
right.
yes.
So that she chose to divorce him so that she could pursue her career in astrology.
It was actually graphology at that point, and astrology came in 1911.
Okay. So,
because fortune telling had been banned, but she also lost her second child to a freak accident when it was 6 months old.
Right. So, okay, great. So then what you have are the two rulers of level 1 and level 2, Venus being level 1 and Saturn being level 2. And because Venus is the primary ruler, it deals with women, with children, with marriage. And then Saturn coming in, Saturn is a principle of separation, of sorrows, of rejection, of withdrawal, of orphanage, or son went to foster care. And so we see how the role of the planets that rule the signs of releasing are the ones that are actually giving the structure to the events of the life. And it's like the lords of the released houses become so important at that time. So I'll just say one more thing, and then I want to hear about the triplicity lords. With the timing, there's another timing technique of planetary periods and ascensional times of times. And during the Venus period, it brings our attention to the 7th house, and that when she got her divorce, the minor period of Venus is 8 years, and the ascensional time of Taurus at her birth latitude was 17 and a half. And that brought her to 25 and a half years of life when the divorce occurred. So that's what I said, like, you see Venus and Taurus in the 7th house, and you say, oh, great relationship. But wait a second, like, she got divorced right away. And as far as we know, there's no other partner on the scene, although there might be hidden partners because Venus is in the 12th, but there's none that are obvious. But what that Venus meant was that she took charge of her own life for the sake of her career by divesting herself of a partner who was not going to support her passion. And this is where the motif of marriage comes in with career in a very strong way in her chart, and stands for her championing of a woman, of the feminine, in a field that was probably pretty much male dominated, especially at that time, and may have not been totally receptive to her, despite the volumes of incredible work that she produced. Okay, so
I got a couple of questions if I can jump in. One is people want to know, Jen, how long do you prepare for the typical client?
It goes anywhere from an hour to a half an hour, depending on whether I've seen the chart before, and just sort of, but never more than an hour. But I am like fully focused. It's like diving into a pool. Like I go all in.
And then Andre's asking, perfected year and its ruler, which Valens division of the year do you use? That's question number 1. Are lunar returns a good way to track down when the ruler will be active during the year? Question 2. Or is that beyond the scope of today? Any of these questions can be.
You work with perfections, Jen?
I do.
Okay, why don't you take that question?
When I'm working with perfections, and you actually taught me this, Demetra, at your Time Lords retreat a number of years ago, I I then break it down into the monthly perfection and watch how that shifts through the chart. And I also work with perfections mostly to rank the transits that I need to be paying most attention to. And so unless the moon is the time lord, I'm not necessarily looking at a lunar return per se, because I'm tracking other types of activity in the chart. And especially when the perfected month comes to the ruler of the perfection in the chart.
And in combing through Ptolemy, I was reminded, he said that when you might use the moon with perfections is when you're doing daily perfections. So you break down the months into the different days, and then that's when you look at the daily perfected house, and that's when the lunar transit will give you information.
That's a lot of detail. I don't ever get that level of detail.
So
unless someone's trying to like plan a launch of something, you know, like otherwise.
the original person that showed me perfections had, whose name will not be mentioned, but had charts of different love interests on the wall by his kitchen phone. And depending on the daily transit would decide which one to call.
Yeah.
So
Scott Silverman has a question. He wants to know what the absolute essential ancient astrological writers are on the lot of spirit and fortune. I guess he's, if you can only read two, who would be the top two, maybe.
In Hellenistic, it's only balance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is no one else.
There is no one else.
Right.
And then, okay, so that sort of answers his second question. Are there any Arabic astrologers that are kind of at your top of the list that everyone should study?
I'm gonna reference Rob Hand when he says Arabic era astrologers,
Yes,
and
yes.
there are I would say Abu Mashar, Benatti, Saul, but I work mostly with Benatti and then somewhat with Omar of Tiberias, out of print, Project Hindsight. I knew this question was coming. He talks about Almutans, which is a little too complex for our conversation today, but
yeah.
I have also run Elizabeth's chart through the Almutan calculations and specifically that of pregnancy to understand her journey as a mother. So.
And also for the people who are asking questions, I appreciate when you say thank you, but then there's an extra step where I have to clear that. So don't feel like you need to thank us. We know you're very thankful for all of what's happening today. And the person that wants me to type out some authors' names, I'll do that later during the break. All right, back to you two. So looking at this chart, what screams like, oh yes, an astrologer, probably is gonna be, is it obvious looking at this chart that would be a career choice given?
100% through, especially the triplicity ruler of astrology in anyone's chart is the third triplicity ruler of the ninth house, and hers is the moon in Cancer on the ninth house cusp.
Right.
So.
And the ninth house was the house of all kinds of divination, including astrologers and prophets and dream interpreters and augurs. And it's just, the list goes on in some of the ancient texts. It was like the joy of the sun from who's on high and who sees all. Mm-hmm. And that in whole sign houses, not only the moon, very powerful in Cancer is there, but Mars, the ruler of the ascendant. Mm-hmm. And so the trajectory of the life is toward divination. And then you could also see that fortune is in the third, which was also a house of divination as well, with sacred rites and rituals.
So she didn't really do charts for people specifically because she ended up becoming so famous, Regulus conjunct her midheaven, that she couldn't have time for one-on-one consults with people. And she constantly wrote about how she was too busy to actually read individual charts. And she was very controversial in her own way and had a bit of as a divorced female in Germany at that time who also had never attended university, she was kind of a thorn in many people's side. So I see that Mars in Cancer very active in her public persona because she was extremely divisional. As much as she was trying to get everyone excited about astrology and give them mundane reflections on what's ahead. She also was constantly throwing these little barbs at her community in the middle of everything, that it adds up to this kind of, you have a chip on your shoulder, Elsbeth, what's going on? But I mean, she was fighting against the tide as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that planets in their fall sometimes are disrespected by others? They don't get the esteem that the planet being in exaltation would be due.
Yeah, it seems like there's a sort of reverb effect where there's an instinctual expectation of that esteem and then not getting it. And so there's this, it's almost like, I mean, if you think about how exaltation can experience the benefits of ownership without paying taxes or making repairs, the fall planet knows what it's missing, whereas the planet in detriment doesn't know what's missing. It's just not ever been there, right? So I think in this case with Saturn and Mars, like it's like almost, if I had been born a man, I would be able to, and I'm not, so here we go, you know?
Right, or if this work was written by, they thought this work was written by a man, they would accept it for the incredible value that it is, but just because I'm a woman, like they're rejecting it. And so the ruler of the third, which is a writing house, is Saturn, that's in the sign of its fall. And so you see that in one place. And then Mars in the ninth in the sign of its fall shows that, I don't know if do you think that she felt, despite the volume of her output, disappointment that her work wasn't recognized for the ways that it merited?
Yeah, I think you see that in the many genres she attempted, because she tried to make, and she did, I mean, she didn't try, she did this, but she made magazines, she made journals. She always attempted a new angle at trying to get the public's attention on astrology. She wrote a novel that was then filmed. And so through all of these attempts, there was this overproduction of work in a way that speaks to some level of insecurity about it because of the constant attempt. And then throughout also this discussion of the finances being wobbly, you know, so she made this magazine, she couldn't sustain it, it only lasted a year. She tried something else and then she had to move, so her resources were undercut again. And so there was a lot of financial instability, even though she was able to produce so much work. It never really led to a kind of security.
We have 3 minutes left.
Yeah.
3-minute warning. And there is a question about primary directions. Were they a feature of Hellenistic astrology?
Ptolemy described them, but they don't seem to be widely used by the other Hellenistic astrologers. And they come more into use later on during the Arabic and then medieval period. Although one might say that circumambulations is a form of primary directions, but they're quite different actually in the way they're used than how Ptolemy laid it out.
Well, this is slightly off topic, but the person is asking for a software recommendation in terms of being able to reliably do primary directions. If you have one.
Talk to Hank Friedman. Hank Friedman will know.
Right.
So look him up.
Yeah.
Hank Friedman does software reviews. There's an elaborate website. Yeah, go to him.
I have 2 questions for Jen. In a minute, I want to know something, how you use triplicity lords, but I also want to know what you think of the moon, even though it's strong, having like Mars on one side and Saturn's ray going to the other side and being besieged.
Yeah. Well, her
how that worked out.
I mean, she had the experience of losing a child at 6 months, and then she divorced her husband and he took Reinhold from her. She didn't get custody.
Okay.
And that was malicious on his part. So she didn't necessarily want to give the child up, but she was forced to do it. And she didn't get to see him for the first 17 years of his life. And I see that as being an extreme representation of that, because for the rest of their connection, once he was emancipated, he actually got to visit her at the age of 17. So I'd love to see his loosing from spirit, to see whether or not he had a loosing of the bond when his mother transmitted astrology to him for the first time. But so she didn't get to really mother Reinhold until he was already basically an adult. And then they had a very intimate connection from then on, but she missed all of those early years. And so I think that's really hard, to have a strong moon with these pressures squeezing,
Right, exactly.
you know. In addition to also perhaps the role she played in the community, the moon was strong, but she wasn't seeing individual clients, and then there were a lot of other societal pressures and prejudices because she didn't have a university education. And at that time in Germany, there actually was a society of astrologers who all had PhDs, and so they judged her publicly for that and didn't include her.
And she did a lot of mundane work, is that true?
Yes, always from the beginning.
Is it the moon, like the people, the masses, and her astrology, and there was a lot of war and conflictual things in the course of her life, so
Yeah.
it could have been the astrology that was surrounded by warlike forces that she tried to address in her mundane work. So I wonder if you would think that might be also connected
In terms of the moon ruling her astrological skill. I mean, perhaps as she grew up, she was, her parents were costume designers. They had a costume factory. And so she was immersed in all of the stories of the world, including she grew up in a castle that had been occupied by Kepler at one point in the 1600s. So she was very in touch with some kind of lineage to this strand of astrology in Germany, and just being aware of global events and curious about biography in the world, and knowing that if someone's birthday was coming up, it'd be a great time to publish an article about it because you'd probably make some money doing that, so,
of course, interested in what's happening now.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's deeper than that in a way of just her curiosity about people in general. And then astrology gave her this really powerful language to sort of, she always say things actually about like it's above religion and above the state. She wasn't interested in the politicians and she wasn't interested in the church. She was loving how astrology could be a universal language, which to me is a red flag because astrology has different cultural manifestations in every single time in the history of the world it's come up. But she imagined that it was this supra-political, supra-religious thing. And you can see that her triplicity ruler of her relationship to religion is Mars in Cancer. So she was not interested in being pious, really.
All right, we are out of.
Okay, Kenneth, we have to say one more thing. Really.
Please.
The asteroid Reinhold.
Yes.
Thank you.
It's 6 degrees of Scorpio in orb of her ascendant and exactly opposite Venus, the strongest planet in her chart. So just that.
Love it.